the cradle of civilization. The first documented cultures. The Sumerians, Elam, Egypt. The beginning of the Bronze Age began. Once upon a time, a long time ago. In a land far, far away. The origin of the civilized world. The earliest major cultures were the Sumerians, the inventors of cuneiform writing in southern Mesopotamia, and the Elamites, today's Iraq. First was Tarzan. He only had one eye trained. He defeated the talking tiger Shere Khan with a rusty dagger. But after that, he became old and wise. He invented language and knowledge. Then he was God, and Lord Ammonius Reed, the first patriarch, the falcon. He had a rich pond. Everything was washed up there. He subjugated the animals and named them. God had a wife, Hathor the cow, the Red Queen, the patriarch's only wife. He had many idiots and cyclopes. And then God had twins, Adam and Eve, revered in Egyptian mythology as Osiris and Isis. The Lord and Patriarch did not yet have a name for these creatures, but a wild boy for farming. He gave the man an assistant. Under one rule, only God can spread his seed, and one should only snack on the Lord's phallus. He called Osiris, but his name was Adam. Adam gave the goddess Isis the name Eve. And the serpent was more cunning than any beast. Eve became pregnant. God was angry and jealous and spit out bile, and banished Adam and Eve from paradise to the fields 40 kilometers to the north, paying tribute, of course. Instead of hoping for God's mercy and wandering around like the other savages, Adam took matters into his own hands and trusted his knowledge and skills in farming. Eve gave birth to Cain. Eve went to the Lord to ask for some food and was blessed by the Lord. With God's help, Eva gave birth to Abel and his twin sister Ava. Adam invented cuneiform writing. One day on the way back after Abel and Cain paid tribute to the Lord, when the firstborn bastard Cain heard that he would one day be the keeper of his master and brother Abel, he killed him. When Adam and Eve found out about this, they sent him and his sister on a journey. To defend himself, Adam gave Cain the sacred mace head. Cain and Ava settled in Mecca. Cain founded a city and then another. When the Lord heard that Abel was dead, he punished Adam with the whip and took Eve to himself. Adam died. The Lord had a substitute son. But at some point the son rebelled. So Lower and Upper Egypt was divided into the white and red crowns. The red crown of the ruler and God, the falcon Re, and the servant's white crown. Excerpt from Osiris saga. Osiris carried a scourge and crook as a royal emblem because he was a friend of the shepherds and flocks. Seth was a friend of the hunters. A dispute arose between the two over the fertile land. They grabbed their swords to settle their dispute. Osiris was defeated by Seth, who killed him and hid him in a thicket. The myth of Osiris and Seth is also told in modified forms. Other texts describe Osiris as arousing the envy of Seth because he taught the Egyptians how to grow crops, gave them laws, taught them pastoralism, and regulated the worship of the gods. This caused the hearts of the inhabitants of both lands to turn to Osiris. He also instructed them in the arts and gave them a peaceful existence. When Osiris did not return home, his sister and wife Isis went on a search, together with her sister Nephthys. After Seth killed her husband and brother Osiris, he threw Isis into prison. Before that, however, Isis had collected the dismembered body parts of Osiris. She was impregnated by the dead Osiris, and their child was Horus. The core of the Osiris myth is that Seth tried with all means at his disposal to defeat Horus in order to become sole ruler. Seth and Horus slept together in the same bed for the sake of peace, but Seth wanted to defile Horus through homosexual intercourse and thereby dishonor him. At that time, the shame lay entirely on the side of the inferior, while the superior thereby expressed the triumph of the victor over the vanquished. However, Horus caught the seed of Seth and brought it to his mother Isis. She then cut off his hand and threw it into the water. But then Isis caused Horus' hand to grow back again and then used the seed of Horus for a ruse by pouring it on the lettuces that Seth ate every day. As a result, Seth was now unknowingly impregnated. When Seth wanted to show the gods that Horus was the inferior and told them about his deed, they screamed and spit on Horus. However, he laughed at them all and declared that Seth was the inferior. He then asked the seed of Seth to come out to Horus. However, when nothing happened, he asked the seed of Horus to come out to Seth. The Horus seed there answered him, emerged from Seth's head, and became a golden sun disk. The humiliated Seth then wanted to take possession of the disk, but he grabbed it and placed it on Horus' head as a crown. At the end of the legend, Isis took Seth to heaven as a consolation for the battle won by Horus, where he kept Horus' enemies away with his fearsome voice. 5,000 years ago, an advanced civilization developed with the Egyptians in the lower Nile Delta, which existed for several thousand years. Early centers were Memphis, Thebes, and Heliopolis. At first, Egypt was divided into Upper and Lower Egypt, and was united under the first pharaoh, Menes, in 3000 BC. Egypt borders Libya to the west. In the south on Nubia. The northeast consisted of individual sovereign states. The Egyptian economy was centered on the Nile, the only fertile place in the desert region, apart from the oases. Later, the Suez Canal also became more important for Egypt, economically and militarily. The only sea connection, trade route, between the western and eastern world. As long as you sail from west to east, and which can be blocked with a few ships. Even today, Egypt first traded with its southern neighbor, Nubia, and only led campaigns against its western neighbor, Libya, mainly because of slaves, poor nomads, easy loot. There was a strict hierarchical form of government in Egypt. The pharaoh at the top, below him his officials, then the slave drivers, and finally with around 90% of the total population of Egypt, the slaves themselves. The life of the Nubians and Libyans was certainly hard in the desert, and the Egyptian masters were able to offer their slaves a fertile place, with plenty of food. The pharaoh was both revered and feared, comparable to Slave Bay from Game of Thrones. With a huge number of slaves, the Egyptians were able to build monumental buildings, which still exist today, and grow into an important power in the region. At the same time, further north in Mesopotamia and what is now Iraq. After a long siege, he conquers the region. Babylon expands its borders and becomes the strongest power in the region. The other empires viewed Babylon's massive rise with suspicion. When Hammurabi again asks his allies for support, Mari, or Amorites, refuses the call. A serious mistake. A short time later, Mari was also incorporated into the Babylonian Empire, as well as large parts of Assur, or Assyria. This gave Hammurabi the title of king of Sumer and Akkad. But the new Babylonian Empire also repeatedly struggled with uprisings and new kings. In addition, wild hordes of Kassites repeatedly invaded and devastated the country, comparable to the Dothraki, fierce mounted archers. In 1700 BC, Ashur conquered Babylon under King Samsi-Adad. But his sons could not continue the empire after his death. In 1600 BC, a new power invaded Mesopotamia. The Hittites ravaged the city of Aleppo and conquered the Yamhad region. From there they continued their campaign to Babylon. Meanwhile in Egypt, The first resistance of the Egyptian vassals against their slave drivers arose as early as 2300 BC. The Libyans in the west, the Nubians in the south, and the city-states of Canaan in the northeast. The city-states of Canaan consisted of the cities of Jericho, biblical Zion, today Jerusalem, as well as Byblos, Damascus, Gaza, and others. In the Bible, Noah curses his son Canaan. The interpretation of the word Canaan is as follows: those who bow down, those who are bowed down, those who are bowed down, those who are humbled, those who are cast out, those who are subjected, and those who are withdrawn. But there were also immigrants from the Semitic region, attributed to Shem, the son of Noah. The Hebrews, today's Jews, developed in this area. In Upper Nubia, the Kerma culture, which began around 3500 BC, developed into the Kingdom of Kerma, which, along with Egypt, is the earliest African state known to us. Around 1700 BC, the Nubians rose up and conquered southern parts of Egypt. Frequent additions of weapons indicate a warlike nature of the Kerma people of this time. A little later, the city-states of Canaan also rose up. The Hyksos, translated as shepherd kings, a group of Semitic, Hurrian, and Amorite immigrants from the areas of Mesopotamia, unexpectedly conquered the northern territories of Egypt. They made use of advanced warfare techniques from the north. Chariots, sickle swords, and composite bowed and overran the Egyptians. Only a small part of Egypt remained as a vassal state of the Hyksos. Yuarnamu is the oldest written legal collection and was introduced by Hammurabi. The Sumerian cult of the weather god once arose in the Syrian region. People settled by the sea and paid homage to the weather god of water and rivers. He was different from the weather god from northern Syria. There they worshipped a similar version of the weather god, but this one stood for lightning, storms, and thunder. Where the bows and chariots come from. North of the Caucasus, Purin or Rama is the supreme god of Slavic mythology. He is the god of storms, thunder, and lightning. His symbols include the iris, the axe, and the oak tree. His name means the one who hits hard. The oldest written tradition comes from the 6th century BC. Procopius of Caesarea reports about a thunder god, whom the Slavs worship as the only deity and to whom they offer animal sacrifices. Where the meteorite once hit and the iron was found, they joined together to form the Hittite League. Among the Slavs who once immigrated from the Caucasus Mountains, the first Hittite settlement arose on the Anatolian mountains under a king under Caraxes, Hattians, and Hurrians. 1600 BC, with the new power of iron, the king of the Hittites went to Babylon and laid waste the city. After the capture of Babylon, he succumbed to an assassination attempt and several regional rulers of the Hutti were established. Babylon fell to the Kassites. The Kassites were the most impious of the barbarians and plundered the remaining temples for the next 400 years. This was also the end of the old Babylonian Empire. The Amorites and the Anunnaki priests were driven out of Babylon to Canaan, where they joined forces with the Hyksos, it is said of crowns of horns, and conquered the upper parts of Egypt. At this time, the biblical Abraham also fled Ur.
1600 BC. Two new powers are pushing into Mesopotamia. The Hittites, an unknown huge army, ravaged the city of Aleppo and conquered the region of Yamahad. There they built defensive fortifications in the south and continued their campaign towards Babylon. Many Semites and Amorites fled to neighboring areas, south, towards Egypt. There they joined forces with the Hebrews living there, the descendants of Canaan, under the flag of Hyksos, and conquered the upper parts of Egypt. Shortly before, the Pharaoh Hatshepsut had led numerous expeditions and campaigns to Nubia and incurred the wrath of the Nubian kingdom of Kerma. The invasion from Nubia. Egyptians weakened by the Ethiopian kingdom of Kerma were completely overrun and reduced to the region of Thebes, in the middle of Egypt, which served as a vassal state of the Hyksos. The Hyksos, militarily superior, with previously unknown weapons, like the horse-drawn two-wheeled war chariot, or the advanced composite bow, took over Egypt. Shortly afterwards, resistance arose. The Egyptians adopted modern warfare and fought back, only under Pharaoh Ahmose I, who prevented an alliance between Hyksos and the kingdom of Kerma by intercepting the messengers. Then through Amenhotep I. With the first campaigns into the south of Egypt, he shook off the yoke of the kingdom of Kerma. And finally through Thutmose I, around the year 1500 BC. After a year-long campaign to the south, he regained Egypt's original territories and made peace with the kingdom of Kerma. Then he turned his attention to the north. His campaigns to the north were only the beginning and were continued by Thutmose II and Thutmose III. The Egyptian pharaoh, in his time, had slaves. The Nile Valley was the most fertile spot far and wide, and the wild men who were abducted from the desert quickly got used to full bellies, beautiful clothes, and impressive buildings, and were ready to help their pharaoh reconquer. More or less. A large city-state, a rare metropolis at the time, had 3,000 to 5,000 men ready for war. A kingdom, up to 10,000. A pharaoh had slaves. First he reconquered all of Egypt from the Hyksos. So began Pharaoh's campaign to the north, to Canaan. He drove Hyksos out of the northern areas of Egypt and advanced further north via the Gaza Strip, towards Megiddo, one of the first known major battles of antiquity around 1457 BC. Armageddon is associated with the city of Megiddo in the Bible. It's about the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse and many plagues. Maybe a lot of people just lost an eye. But perhaps the Bible prophecy simply has not yet been fulfilled. The battles at this time were as follows. There weren't many helmets or armor. The composite bow had a usable range. Archers shot each other with blunt arrows until they ran out of arrows. Then they attacked each other with axes. The horse-drawn chariot served as a fast cavalry archer and provided some cover from the horses and log cart. The pharaoh demonstrated in advance his determination and the determination of his slaves, as well as his divine power in countless victories, and made it clear to the shepherd kings who is in charge. The defenders retreated to Megiddo and closed the gates. It is said that 1 or 2 people were dragged over the wall by Tide Laundry. Megiddo were starved and surrendered after 7 months of siege. In 1457 BC, Thutmose III defeated, in the Battle of Megiddo, the Canaanite princes to open up a land route to Syria. At this time, the rulers of Canaan were being oppressed by a second power, the Hittites in the north. The focus of the Anatolian Hittites was clearly on Babylon. But Pharaoh Thutmose III expanded further north, purely for safety reasons. So he came across the Hittites, who were about to take over all of Babylon. After the sack of Babylon, the king of the Hittites was unable to maintain his power. After internal disputes, the king of the Hittites succumbed to an assassination attempt. As usual, Mesopotamia descended into chaos, the wild hordes of the Kassites, also called Dothraki, were able to conquer Babylon in the fray. That was the end of the old Babylonian Empire. The Hittite descended into rebellions and went through a process of forming independent city-states ruled by autonomous rulers. New empires arose out of nothing, like the merger of the Hurrians, a split of the Hittite, to the kingdom of Mitanni, which rose up against Assur, rebelled and conquered the Assyrians. The borders of the 3 kingdoms met in Canaan: Egypt, Hittite, and the Mitanni. Egypt continued its campaigns to the north, out of pure defiance because of possible invaders, without knowing what's waiting there. They have never expanded so far before. The Mitanni fought a three-front war and focused on the west. Syria. The upper parts of Canaan. For some time they became the dominant power in the region. But Egypt and the Hittite had agreed to a formal alliance. So the areas in the upper part of Canaan changed hands again and again. And they had to be reconquered again and again by the pharaohs. There were numerous battles between the Mitanni and the Egyptians. The Hittite currently supported the rightful Assyrian claimant to the throne. It was not until 1458 that Assyria, through a rebellion, was able to surprise the Mitanni, weakened by war, and recapture parts of its territories. Many areas of the Mitanni fell to the Hittite, who once again assumed a dominant position in the region. Through a merger of numerous empires, the Hittites became the Great Empire of Hittite. So initially only two players remained. The areas in Syria, Upper Canaan, changed again. And there were numerous battles between the Hittite and the Egyptians, such as under Pharaoh Ramses II. The Battle of Kadesh at 1274, or the Battle of Dapur at 1271. Many loincloths were used again with blunt arrows. Many lost an eye. Many battles went down in the annals. Then the battles where many have lost an eye. The Osiris turned to Babylon under the Kassites and slowly regained their old strength. The Elamites also repeatedly waged wars against the empires of Mesopotamia. There was no peace, only war. Egypt's war against the Hittite Empire for control of northern Canaan produced no clear winner in the period that followed. Rule over the Syrian cities changed again and again. Only when the Assyrian Empire in the north became a threat to the Hittites did the Hittite Empire close in 1259 BC. BC signed a peace treaty with Egypt because they wanted to avoid a war on two fronts. The Egyptian-Hittite peace treaty is considered the oldest written peace agreement. His excerpts hang in the UN building in New York. But things turned out very differently than expected. At the other end of the known world, Crete, Atlantis, Zeus. Hercules defeats the Hydra. A new power is coming to light. The Mycenaean Greeks from the mainland conquered the Minoan culture based on Crete. The Bronze Age is coming to an end. The areas of Mesopotamia and Iraq, rich in bronze, lost military superiority with the advent of iron. The end of the Bronze Age ushered in the Dark Ages, from which little is known. Syria. Bronze Age. 1457 BC. Typically, defeated men were enslaved at this time. Valuable manpower. But Thutmose I unleashed the wrath of the gods on the Syrians. Armageddon. After the ignominious takeover of the upper parts of Egypt by the Syrian-born Canaan rulers, Thutmose I shook off the yoke of the oppressors and reconquered Egypt. Now the new, 22-year-old Pharaoh is leading a campaign north, across the Gaza Strip. The previous pharaohs did not know how to kill and stood for life. They preferred to enslave. Back then, people threw stones at each other and attacked each other with small axes. Daggers and throwing knives were very popular. Bows had a range of 50 meters and the arrows were sharpened. Bronze is generally a flexible metal. Sharpened weapons became blunt after a few blows. The people were small, but robust and had to beat themselves up for a long time until someone dropped dead. But the usurpers, the Syrians, also brought new weapons from Mesopotamia to Egypt. The composite bow, a powerful weapon with an increased range of up to 90 meters and corresponding penetrating power. The horse was not yet widespread in Egypt at that time, and the warriors were afraid of it. The horse-drawn chariot enhanced the effect and enabled rapid movement across the battlefield. The pharaoh adopted these new technologies and armed his army of archers. His army of archers was supported by just over 200 horse-drawn chariots. 10,000 warriors, Egyptians, Nubians, and other slaves follow him north on an expedition beyond Egypt's old borders into enemy territory that is still unexplored. to Syria. He crossed the Gaza Strip into Palestine and met an equal enemy force there. Thutmose did not go undiscovered. The king of Kadesh has gathered the Syrian allies under his leadership in Megiddo. The enemy knew he was coming. Thutmose knew that the enemy knew he was coming. But the enemy didn't know that Thutmose knew that the enemy knew he was coming. Thutmose followed the sea over the coast and approached Megiddo from the southwest. The Carmel Mountains stood between him and Megiddo. The Megiddo forest, part of the Carmel Mountains, could be passed via an arch to the left and right. To avoid looting and devastation in the cities of Yaknim and Tanakh, the king of Kadesh divided his army into 5,000 warriors each. Both cities were only 10 kilometers from Megiddo and could be reached within an hour's walk. This allowed him to form a wide front and definitely stop the advancing enemy. To defend Yaknim and Tanakh, he did not need chariots and left them behind in Megiddo. So he thought, the king of Kadesh, divided his army and sent it to Yaknim and Tanakh. The pharaoh did not know the cartography of the area and could only lead his forces along the old paths. But Thutmose found a way through the mountains, an unreal place from ancient Babylonian myths. He found a gap, a chasm of sharp stone, lousy stalactites from above and nasty stalagmites from below. Despite the skepticism of his advisors, he sent his force through the gap, one after the other. The horses and chariots in particular posed a problem. He chose the middle path, the Gorge of Ara, the Valley of Death. They left the gorge in the morning and passed the Carmel Mountains in the evening. The pharaoh remained undetected. He camped outside Megiddo and obtained information. He quickly understood the situation. He had found himself between the left and right flanks of the enemy army. Syrian messengers rushed west and east to Yaknim and Tanakh. He couldn't catch them all. In a few hours, the army stationed there would rush to Megiddo and encircle and destroy the Egyptian forces on all sides. Megiddo, a huge fortress with walls 6 meters thick, situated on an earthen rampart. In this short time, completely impregnable. But Thutmose had an idea. Just as the Syrian king divided his army, he would do the same. He divided his army. With his mightiest warriors, he went against the army from Tanakh. His weakest men, at that time, should not be underestimated, many with disabilities. But useful as an archer, he left behind for a surprise attack. A previously unknown tactic. The army from Tanakh proved to be strong. The enemy had new types of exotic units, rider cavalry, and heavy horse-drawn chariots. Pharaoh fought at the forefront, leading the chariots. The chariot enabled him not to run around the battlefield like a poor slave, to shoot at the enemy from a distance with a bow and arrow. And Pharaoh was good at it. When the Egyptian force met the enemy, Thutmose sat on the flank with his chariots. There he faces the Syrian elite, early spear cavalry and heavy horse-drawn chariots. These soldiers had bronze armor and helmets, in contrast to the normal archer infantryman, who was often only dressed in rags. The pharaoh's light chariots were inferior in direct close combat. These were made of flexible bamboo-like material, and were simply tied together with string. Sometimes, if you look at it closely, this tied-together structure would simply fall apart or even burst into flames. The heavy Syrian chariots, on the other hand, consisted of a wooden chariot hammered together and had deadly scythes on the chariot wheels. They were intended directly for close combat and were manned by spear throwers. But the pharaoh knew how to use the lightness of his chariots and kept his distance while firing arrows at the enemy from a distance. Since most of the Syrian chariots remained in Megiddo, the Canaanite elite was at a disadvantage due to the numerical superiority of the Egyptian chariots. One Syrian elite after another was forced to flee. Meanwhile, the Egyptian force engaged in a long-range duel with the Syrian force. Both parties threw stones, arrows, and spears at each other. when Pharaoh took over the enemy's flank. He called for the attack. His troops followed his example and stormed the enemy. With a single charge, the opposing force collapsed. The Pharaoh relentlessly pursued those fleeing to Megiddo. Meanwhile, on the other side of the battle line, the enemy force from the west, from Yakmim, approaches Megiddo, ready to stab the Pharaoh in the back and create a gap to Megiddo for the fleeing allies. But Pharaoh has taken precautions. He told the rest of his troops to hide behind a hill. When the enemy advances from Yakmim, his warriors are supposed to climb the hill and literally pin the enemy down. His reserve army consisted of the poorest of the poor from Egypt. And in an open battle with their self-made bows, they would be no match for the better-equipped enemy force. But the Pharaoh understood the advantages of the bow like no other and knew how to use his reserve archers. Once over the hill, the Egyptians surprised the astonished Syrians and began Armageddon. They didn't have much, just their bows and arrows, and unleashed a hail of arrows with unprecedented power. The surprise attack was a complete success. Unlike the Egyptians, the Syrian army had shields and could withstand the fire. But advancing was out of the question. The men didn't dare run into the arrow storm. It was hailing from all sides. The Syrians were literally nailed into the ground. Those who were lucky lost an eye. The Egyptian reserve did not consist of the strongest archers, and their arrows were also of the worst quality. Simple sharpened wood without a spring. You had enough for that. Good and cheap. The Syrians were hit by hundreds of arrows and pinned into the ground until they finally died miserably. A massacre. As if the heavens would open up and swallow you all. Every attempt to advance failed. God's wrath struck you from above. The battlefield filled with nailed. The screams could still be heard in Megiddo. The Syrian force from Yakmim regrouped and made the final charge. Despite bitter resistance from the Syrians, their forces were severely wiped out and they had to flee to Megiddo in desperation over what had happened to them, calling for mom. When the screams of death were heard, the gates in Megiddo were closed. Individual soldiers were pulled over the wall by tying their laundry together. The Syrian force, totaling 10,000 men, was completely wiped out on both fronts and had to retreat to Megiddo with its remaining survivors. The survivors continued to resist and were able to withstand the Egyptian siege for 7 months until they finally surrendered. Thutmose the Pharaoh captured great wealth when he took over the city. Many horses and chariots, gold, some rare copper armor, and much more. In the Bible, Armageddon also refers to Armageddon or Armageddon in the Revelation of John, the place of the eschatological decisive battle in the war of the great day of God Almighty. In the broader sense, the term in theology refers to the eschatological decisive battle. For this reason, Armageddon is the symbol of every battle in which, when the need is greatest and the believers are oppressed, the Lord suddenly reveals his power on behalf of his afflicted people and defeats the enemy. When God grants a small handful a glorious victory over an enemy who vastly outnumbers them, it is a kind of Armageddon. Perhaps the prophecy, the final decisive battle between good and evil in Israel, has simply not yet been fulfilled. If you don't want to miss the next episode, subscribe and leave a like. In this sense, until next time, and have fun at Armageddon.
it today! Yes, Commander!